Hello, joined here by Steve Mossop, Executive Vice President at Leger. Steve, we've been through a long campaign, and Leger, frankly, nailed it last night in terms of your predictions.
Thank you, Harold. It's always we're always waiting with bated breath on election day, and last night it was like watching an overtime hockey game, falling asleep at the TV, only to wake up in the morning and having the overtime still continuing. So it still goes on. We still have a couple of seats that are up in the air, but yeah, we are pretty proud of the numbers. Overall, it looks like the Conservatives did a little better than what we thought. You know, a couple of points higher. And you and I talked about that just last week. We said, what would it take for the Conservatives to do a little bit better? A couple of factors. One of them is we don't know the distribution of the vote turnout by youth. So if youth did turn up at the polling stations at a larger degree, like I said, could happen, then that might be the reason they were up a couple of points. We also saw another cratering of the NDP popular support, even in the final couple of days. So I guess if you look at the last couple of weeks and you see the numbers keep going down, we had 3 days in our last poll before actual election day. Maybe those 3 days just to continue the trend of that downward spiral. And you can see the result now, what a disaster it was federally and provincially for the NDP.
Do you think the voter turnout in BC, which I believe is around 70%, like you say, we're still waiting for some numbers to come in, was that a factor either way?
Not a huge amount. I mean, we don't have the final numbers. They haven't published it from Elections Canada, but there's been, I know a note just passed by my screen. I'm not sure if it's accurate or not, but the turnout was 67, which puts it on the higher side of elections. You have to go back to 2019 to see a number like that. So it did pop up a couple of points, but so that could also have been a factor, mainly again with youth. So we still have a few days to disseminate everything that happened, but the trends that we had identified in the last several days of the campaign still hold true.
Okay. Well, why don't we start with anything? I know it's still early and we're all still digesting the numbers, but anything looking at the new map in BC, anything surprise you?
Well, maybe just I had maybe cautiously pointed out and presented the idea that the NDP could only pick up a handful of seats, and I was stepping out on a limb there. And having looked back, I probably should have been firmer and said, yeah, they are in big trouble. And look at Singh's own riding. I mean, he just got decimated in his own votes from his from a riding he was well ahead in the previous federal election. So that's probably the number one story. And we called that, I guess, for several weeks, even several months in a row, is that cratering of NDP support. So that was quite detailed. A little bit of surprise with Poilievre and his riding and how he did there. That was a little bit of a shocker to us, and it looks like he's still hanging on. We'll see what the next few days bring. But yeah, just overall, when you look at even the close ridings that are still up for grabs in British Columbia, a lot of those were not on the radar of ones that we might have picked as areas that are really unpredictable. So it was quite a night, let's just say.
Well, let's look at a couple of those maybe before we step back again and look at BC writ large. But in Vancouver, in Vancouver Kingsway, where popular incumbent Don Davies that was much closer than it typically would have been.
It really was, and some of the other close races, on Vancouver Island and Victoria that were supposed to have been close races that weren't close were a real shocker. So it was only the seats that we really thought the NDP didn't have a chance of losing that became the close ones to look at.
Well, and then if you pull way back and you look at rest of BC, there's this red dot still in Kelowna. What do you make of that?
Well, that's a bit of a mystery to me. I wouldn't have guessed that. What was it? 150 votes on election night. It's what is it now? Just a handful of votes after the mail-ins are counted. I'm not sure if it's considered final. I know they'll likely do a recount.
We are still talking about preliminary results to be sure, and the threshold for a recount and what that might look like. But even for the Liberals to come that close in Kelowna was maybe a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, and that's a story throughout Canada where the Liberals did far better than they ever would have dreamed of doing, and even in the final couple of days did better than many thought in certain ridings. As I said, the Conservatives pulled out the popular vote. really, broke their own record from last election and did better than they did last time around, won more seats than. So it's an odd situation where they did so much better than they did the last federal election, yet they still lose. It's just one of the stories to uncover this election that's a bit of a head scratcher and maybe a first and last in our country.
When you look at what issues were resonating with people, is there any, then you were tracking that throughout the campaign, is there anything in that for BC at least that explains this very clear rural-urban divide? You have Metro Vancouver that is painted Liberal red, and you have the rest of the mainland that is blue.
Yeah, that's something we saw in the provincial election that you and I covered. Just we've almost become more polarized as a nation and as a province than what we ever have been. There's more dividing lines, and we talked earlier in the campaign about those who voted Conservative were really entrenched in their position from a very early point. We started this election campaign 5 and a bit weeks ago. The polling numbers for the Conservatives were fairly solid then, and at the end of election day, they did a couple of points better. But those behind it really were convinced almost from day one. There wasn't a lot of wavering. The undecided vote was always so much smaller with the Conservatives than it was for the Liberals. So that's that dividing line between rural. They just hold those values much more entrenched than what those in the cities hold, and that's the divide's getting farther apart than closer.
And can you explain at all what happened in Richmond? We have one Liberal seat and one Conservative seat next door to each other.
There's me scratching my head there because that one I'm still trying to decipher. And some of the nuances of those neighborhoods that don't really fit the overall region are a bit of a puzzle. We talked earlier about candidates not really having much of a sway in this particular election. It was all about the leaders and all about the party position. But no, there was a couple that stood out. The Green Party win by Elizabeth May, and right. You look at some of the other more Jenny Kwan's win. I mean, those are strong personalities that have dominated through time, and so those ones, no surprises there. But there was some regional plays that came down to personalities and strength of the individual candidate. And we saw that in the North Island as well, where a candidate had won who was quite popular, well known in the community, and Conservatives took a seat that we didn't expect that they would take.
Historically, when you look at Metro Vancouver, some of the more affluent ridings, we think of west side of Vancouver, North Shore, maybe South Surrey. The Conservatives have won over the years, or at least been competitive. They were blown out in those spots last night. What happened?
Look at the North Shore, like it's a swath of red, and I can't remember the last time I've seen that. I mean, we did have some boundaries redrawn in my own riding here in North Vancouver, but West Vancouver, some surprises there. So it really, we talked in one of the earlier interviews about the idea that people were voting for the Conservatives not to win, as opposed to really supporting Carney. Yes, Carney had his supporters. He had a strong level throughout the campaign. He was seen as a better adversary to Trump. But ultimately, the 17% of voters in BC and nationally who voted against the Conservatives so that they didn't win, I think that was another story that will play out time and time again, because that number is usually a few points. Articles talk about 2 to 5 points of strategic voting, and here we have triple or 4 times the number of that.
And of course, you reminded me every week through the campaign that all the candidates seem to be running against Donald Trump, and we saw that pivot. So when you're talking about affluent voters in some of these areas, these are people with a big economic stake in the future of the province, and they migrated to Carney, I gather, as
they
the
did,
best.
And we covered that quite a few polls back, but his resume really stood out, and that was some of the those undecided voters who ultimately chose the Liberals over the Conservatives, which was atypical. They looked at the strength of his resume and said, this guy has what it takes to deal with Donald Trump. He just has the education, the background, the world history, the connections in Europe, and monetary policy. It was hard to argue that. So that was another underlying motivating factor of swinging to the Liberals.
Now, we've seen this in past elections where a party has crumbled. We've seen it with different parties provincially and federally, and the NDP, it's happened before. I mean, who knows when we're going to have another election. It is a minority government, so goodness, we could be back into this in a few months. But anything you can sort of see in the polling that might give New Democrats any grain of hope?
Yes, absolutely. And I think Singh picked up on that in his farewell speech last night. He had said something to the effect of, we almost we were the sacrificial lamb for the country. We did our part by allowing the Liberals to win and the Conservatives not to win. So there was almost a subtext there of, hey, this is okay. We can lay ourselves down as a sacrifice to this greater good for the country. But remember, they were second place. There was something like 28% of voters throughout the country who said that they would support the NDP if they weren't supporting the party that they chose. So that's unusual too. It's usually I'm supporting who I'm supporting, and there's nobody else on the horizon. But to have a strong second place ballot, even though it doesn't count in a first past the post, it still symbolically says that maybe they're not decimated yet. If they can have a new leader and a fresh approach, and there's a different circumstance in the next election and rebuild. So I don't think it's the case that they're going to be decimated forever. They will pick themselves out of the ashes and return.
And then for Poilievre, who came up just short after being so far ahead in the polls in December, what's his path based on what you're seeing in the polls?
Well, his own caucus and some of them who have spoken out really nailed it precisely. They said he didn't have a well-articulated plan of how to deal with Trump. He'd spent the last 2 or 3 years practicing his lines about how he was opposed to the Liberals. And then when he was thrown off track by the various events that Trump helped unfold, he didn't have an adequate response. And Canadians saw that and they said, wow, Carney has such a well-articulated path to dealing with him. And Poilievre almost disappeared, it seemed, for a week or two in the campaign and didn't have a lot to say about it. So I think that was his Achilles heels. He didn't come out strong enough. We knew that was the number one issue in the election by a long shot, overriding housing, inflation, healthcare by 2 to 1 on each of those. So that was his failure, simple and plain.
All right. Well, this is great, Steve. I've enjoyed our conversations over the last several weeks. See you at the next election.
Yes, it was really enjoyable, Harold. It was. We thought it would be boring 3 months ago when we said we would do this series. We said we hope we had something to talk about, and wow, we got what our wish was.
Absolutely. All right. Talk again soon. Thank you.
Take care.